Hi everyone, how's it going? I'm Cody here with Atro as I believe his name. He works at Foundry, for those who don't know. He's so kindly joining us today for some questions and answers, of which we've gotten a bunch of community questions already ahead of time. If you want to ask a question and we have time after we get through what have already been asked and voted on, drop it either in Twitch or preferably in the Splendid League's Discord, where you can vote on each other's questions and rank them up, so we ask them in that order. Yeah, Atro, how's it going? Oh, hold on. Hold on. Uh,
I'm muted.
you're muted on my side. See, this is why we asked the first question. It means nothing. Now that you've let out the mean things, you were saying?
Well, I feel like I've been suppressed, and I'm just gonna leave now after this.
All right,
Cruel
it's been a
unusual
really
treatment.
good
Good stream,
Q&A.
good stream, guys. Good stream. No, I don't even know what I said. I said something along the lines of it's been a great week. Lots happening, lots of cool stuff, new content. You know, stuff happening on the development front. I'm just excited to hang out and get a chance to answer some tough questions from the from the developer community. I think the Twitch streams that I do from time to time, it's tough to take like technical questions in those because the audience is a lot more broad. So yeah, I'm happy to get a chance to do some Q&A with the smaller audience, and we'll see how it goes.
Yeah, we appreciate you taking the time to be able to talk about this. I know, yeah, it's super helpful and useful, I know, to tons of people to be able to ask about the future of Foundry or features coming up. And people often get a little bored with the code side of things when they're a non-developer. It's hard to blame them. So I'm glad we have some time, and hopefully we can do this again in the future. We have, I think, at least a dozen questions lined up in front of us. So let's get started. So the first question of the day is we announced Matt from Encounter Library is joining on the staff. First of all, congrats. I'm excited about that. Matt's a cool guy. I'm sure that he actually made the opening image for this stream. Matt's in the chat. Hi, Matt. He's just so cool and such a cool person. His videos are great. They're really all I watch on YouTube anymore on repeat. Do you have any announcements about other hires?
Yeah, I'm being set up on this one. Well, firstly, definitely congratulations to Matt. Really excited to have him join the team. Really excited to work with him. I do have some news on other hires. I'm not making official announcements yet, but I can make a little bit of an unofficial announcement. So the hiring process went super well. We had lots of great candidates, and because of the flexibility of some of the candidates that applied, it allowed me to get a little bit more developer resources out of the hiring process than I had originally expected. And so over the coming, months, there will be some new faces joining the team, one of whom will be pretty familiar to many of you, because I can give a little soft teaser that person's name begins with Cody and ends with Swendrowski.
Nailed it.
And so little soft announcement there. Yeah, so for those of you freaking out in the chat and telling me what a terrible mistake I've made, this is the good. It's cool. I'm really thrilled to say that Cody will be working with us on an official basis starting a little while later. But Cody will not be the only dev hire that I will be welcoming. So the identity of some mysterious stranger is yet to be revealed. But yeah, it's really exciting. It's a really exciting time for the team. Really exciting time to be growing. I think the applicants for the roles were really super talented, and it made the process both really hard, but also really easy, because it's like, I want to hire everyone. Can I just can I have 1,000 employees? Unfortunately, I can't, but maybe there will be additional opportunities in the future. So, we'll see. But yeah, really excited to be growing the team. I think it's going to let us do a lot of exciting, cool new things, more things, I think, hopefully. And yeah, and so, so early congratulations to Cody for that. I'm really excited for us to work together, and then also for you to continue, in your role as an ambassador for the developer community. Although I'm sure there will be probably some little changes on that front, but plenty of time to talk when the time comes.
Now, the only unfortunate part is about all of the moderation team and a good dozen other people have named themselves Cody on the League Discord. So, it's really up in the air about which one it is at this point.
It could be anyone.
It really could be.
Could be anyone.
But yes, I am looking forward to joining on officially in the coming weeks and helping to do what I was doing before, but in a little more of an official capacity. Yes, we're all employed.
Or a lot more of one, as the case may be.
Yeah, probably the case. So we have it set up that we can swap to use screen sharing code in Foundry as the questions require. Feel free to at any point just indicate that you want to do so. But for now, we'll keep in this view until we get to that point. So, start of the second question is from Vance with 18 stars or votes. Foundry uses a variety of third-party libraries such as KneeDB, Socket.io, jQuery, Handlebars, Pixie, and etc. Given that Howler was removed recently, are there any other libraries you're considering changing or removing? Are there any under consideration that to be added?
Yeah, I can see why that's a popular question. Although before I can even answer it, I can't really quite get over having my mind blown that you just said KneeDB.
KneeDB. That's how it's pronounced, right?
I've never even considered saying that. So yeah, I think again, let's just end the stream there, because we clearly can't go on.
Look, your hiring process didn't discover that I pronounce it KneeDB. So KneeDB. Whose fault is that?
Yeah, clearly the interviewing process was deeply flawed. Okay, so let me try and get back on track. Yeah, so libraries. Obviously, libraries are pretty fundamental to the JavaScript development ecosystem, for better or worse. I think there's a lot of culture around using lots of libraries. There's a lot of great libraries out there to use. I think my own thought process and my own preferences have always been to be a little bit more, I guess, sparing in terms of libraries, and that's sometimes a good thing, and sometimes it's my own being my own worst enemy, I suppose. But I think as far as the question being, are there any libraries that will be added or ones that might possibly be removed? So I think the Howler making way for the native web audio API is an interesting one. As far as removals go, I think some potentials, none of which are really confirmed or planned at this time, but I do think that in the long run, the client-side Socket.io library is probably no longer really necessary, because there is a native WebSocket API that has an actually pretty compatible interface that you can start just using the native WebSocket API directly without needing to use the client-side Socket.io library. So that's one that might end up making way at some point. I think also, although I don't want to spook anyone, I mean, this is probably a statement that would make half people happy and half people terrified. I think probably in the long run, I would remove jQuery as a building block. But That's not something that I anticipate doing anytime soon. It's pretty fundamental to the way that some of the Foundry applications are designed right now, just because it makes some aspects of DOM manipulation a lot easier. And so having jQuery available and using it is, it's an important convenience layer at the moment. And I think it would take a lot to remove that, I think. And so I'm not sure if it will ever happen, but I do think that eventually moving more towards using just like native JavaScript DOM methods is probably something I'd be interested in. But yeah, as far as additions go, that's a tough question because I think there's a lot that Foundry can do and would be able to do better with the use of some libraries that would enable that. I think it's a little too soon to say, but I think that at some point the software is going to be due for like a V2 application framework. So, as many of you know, there is this like application class that creates and manages the UI elements. And that's kind of a homebrew creation. And it does some things very well. It does some things slightly clumsily. And I think it's been around since early on. And while it's received some updates and improvements and stuff, I think the basic idea is one that is probably due for a redesign at some point, just the way that like the document concept was due for a redesign in 08. So when that happens, I think it could be that there's certain libraries or ones that are like good choices to use. I also think that some of the graphical stuff that I want to do to keep pushing the functionality of the canvas to do more with lighting, with weather, with particles. In the longer term, there might be some Pixie, like smaller sort of Pixie libraries that would be good to include, that would include some helper functionality there. That's kind of what occurs to me right now. In terms of potential additions, potential subtractions, there's nothing that's really on the chopping block or on the to add block that's really like concretely planned at this point, though.
Are you going to take the new audio engine you wrote and release it as an independent piece? Or is it more like written explicitly for Foundry and really couldn't be pulled elsewhere?
Well, I think it's pretty good and it could be helpful, but I think that it is a very bespoke solution in terms of like it is designed to solve the needs that Foundry has. And I feel like it would probably be too limited for what external customers would want to use in like an audio library. It's definitely like way less feature rich than something like Howler. It just does a few specific things in a specific way. And I think it's a smart way to use. I think I'm proud of it. I think it's good code. I think it's a good way to use the audio API. But I'm not sure it's enough to merit that. I guess it could be. I mean, it is kind of a nice little layer, but it's not something that I have planned to release broadly. Although, I'm potentially open to the idea.
And this is another extension of that. So we know you removed Howler because it was having some issues, and you designed a new engine instead. Like, what were some of your considerations of why remove Howler and why write my own? And then when you decide you're going to write your own, what were some of like what does the process look like when you're architecting something like that?
Tough. It's a good question. I knew I was going to get some tough ones today. So first, let me say I don't view myself as some sort of like foolproof savant in this. In that, I think I ended up making some choices that seemed to be the right ones to get a certain task done and to improve the framework. I think there's lots of ways to do that, and there's probably lots of ways to do it that would have been better than what I did. But I do think that why did I consider removing Howler? Well, I have a two-part answer to that. The first part answer is that ultimately Foundry exists more at the forefront of web technology, and that I specifically don't worry about supporting older browsers. I specifically don't worry about supporting older versions of modern browsers. I kind of assume that people are using a modern version of a modern browser, and that assumption is very powerful. It does have cost, but I think the cost is not so great, and so it's an assumption I'm really glad that I've made. Now, Howler is a library that was developed and was kind of a gold standard in terms of how to support web audio playback in a cross-browser, cross-version kind of way, where Howler can provide, one interface that you can use and then sort of trust that it's going to work on lots of devices and lots of browsers. Now, what that means is that Howler incorporates a lot of logic, like a lot of stuff. It's making a lot of decisions around how to load files, how to play files, because it's trying to support everything, basically. I don't need to support everything. I just need to support modern versions of modern browsers. And so, my problem is much smaller than Howler, the problem that Howler is solving. And secondly, Howler, was developed at a time when the web audio API was like the cutting edge. It was brand new. It wasn't well supported yet. It wasn't really an option for most people yet. And so Howler existed to kind of bridge that transition period where, people wanted to start moving to using web audio, but they needed HTML5 audio fallback, and maybe they needed even like non-HTML5 audio fallback. So they might have needed a fallback for the fallback. And so I think ultimately, like, trying to just use the web audio API directly was a way to do basically what Howler was designed to do, but just kind of go straight to the source now that API is standardized and available for all the browsers that Foundry supports, just going straight to it. And then, another key consideration was that from everything I've read online, doing a bit of research, the web audio API has a really great reputation as being super well designed, as being really well thought out, easy to use, well documented. And in my experience working with it, I think that reputation is deserved. I think it's a really well-made API. I think it was really pleasant to work with, and I had to learn some concepts, but I think it was great, really. And that kind of ended up reinforcing things. And I think, so sorry, I've given such a long-winded answer.
No, that's a good answer
of the question. I think I've lost track a little bit of the second half of the question, but bring me back up to speed. So I talked about like what were some of the key considerations.
So you talked about why move away from it. So then you decide, all right, I'm going to move away from it. When you're building a new engine, what's your consideration? Like, what's that process look like for you?
Well, I think there's different types of developers that have different types of processes. I think some really like to scope out a lot early on. Like, what are all of the APIs that I think I might want to have? What are all of the features? What does the overall framework look like? That has value. That's a really good approach. And, for some devs and some teams, that is really the best way to do it. For me, I tend to start very small. I tend to start with what is the specific problem that I'm trying to solve. And so I started really small with this. I started with, how do I load like an MP3 file, and how do I make that file make sound on my speakers? There's a very specific small problem of, how make sound do. And so, that's where I started. And I started building, methods and APIs around that very sort of base functionality. Like I want to load a sound, I want to play a sound, I want to stop a sound, I want to pause a sound, I want to fade the volume. That came much later, but like I kind of just started thinking about, well, what are the basic actions that I need to do with a sound? And then the little framework that I made started to take shape, and then I started to hit areas where, oh, well, this isn't working quite as well as I wanted it to, so I need to redesign, need to change it. But the basic functionality for audio, it's it's really nothing that any of us will be surprised about, because we all know what it's like to play audio. We all know what it's like to use a audio player on our phone, or Pandora or Spotify or whatever. Like, we know that there's a play function. We know that there's a next sound, a next track function. We know that there's a volume slider. So ultimately, like, just by virtue of it being kind of a common thing, that sort of defined the needs of the system in a basic way. So that's kind of where it started. And specifically to the problem of Foundry's use case, then I started to really focus on what are the Foundry specific needs, in that we've got playlists and we've got ambient sounds. Also, of course, just like one-off sound effects. So what's needed in order to support that, in a good way. So yeah, I think, I don't know. I don't pretend to have taken the best possible approach here, but I think, to summarize what I said, I just sort of started small with, like, how do I make sounds work? And then how do I build upon that to achieve the specific end goals that Foundry needs, of playlists, of ambient, of one-off sound effects. And I'm not trying to do a lot more than that. I think the design is relatively extensible, and the power of the web audio API allows to, extend upon that functionality further. But there's going to be things that need to be realized. There's going to be testing that needs to happen. There's going to be areas where, things are not as functional in 08.1 as they were previously. Like, an example of that came up either earlier today or yesterday, where, in 07, someone was able to take a audio stream URL, like a URL that vends an audio stream, and use that as the input to a playlist sound. And because Howler, as I mentioned previously, is kind of this like do everything library, it could take that as an input and figure out what type of audio source it represented, construct the right type of audio node, and then provide the same interface as if it were just an MP3 file. And so this is the kind of thing, like, 08 actually regresses in this area. It wasn't a feature that I was tracking, and so it wasn't something that I removed. I just didn't think anyone was doing that. I didn't realize it. And so, like, that won't work right now in 08. But the web audio API does, of course, have a certain node type that allows you to load an audio stream and then have the same kind of interaction with that API as you get with a buffer node, which is kind of the workhorse that I'm regularly using. So, this type of thing can be supported. It's just, there will be some growing pains as the software grows away from Howler, which kind of automatically does everything, but it does way more. And some of the things that it does were frankly problematic. Some of the audio issues in 07 specifically were, attributable to some of the choices that Howler was making, or the choices that I was making in misimplementing Howler, which is, of course, also possible. But that's another complexity that you get if you're relying upon a module, is that, it could be that the module itself has problems, or it could be that you as the developer just aren't an absolute expert in how to use the library. So anyways, that's a very long-winded answer, but
I think that's good. A lot of developers here, we have entire channels dedicated to how do you work, how do you develop, and I think that's the kind of thing that's interesting to other developers to hear. It's a very familiar process, and running into things that you didn't expect, like people loading streams when you didn't think that was even supported. That makes sense. That happens to all of us.
Mhm.
Let's go on to the next question. Vance asks, it seems like the new overhead tile system has some adjacency to the commonly requested elevation feature. Will the new overhead tiles implement any sort of awareness of elevation, potentially allowing features such as multiple floors? If not, is this a future feature that you may consider? And what's your speculation for, timeline on things like that?
Yeah. I probably am about to give an answer that's like relatively unsatisfying, but I do want to be straightforward. So I was doing some brainstorming around like what might a long-term design look like for levels, um, because I want that too. I also love the idea of a scene where you go from the basement to the first floor to the second floor, and it's all very seamless. And you maybe have like balconies where you might be on one floor, but you see down to the lower floor. I was doing a lot of thinking about this, and both in terms of like what the user experience might be, as well as what the underlying data structures and the way that the canvas would need to behave in order to support it. And I decided that it's a great idea and it's something that I'd love to do someday. But I think it's a big step. It's a big step to go from tiles are strictly two-dimensional in terms of like they are underneath, there's XY and they're underneath the token layer, to a world where tiles are partially three-dimensional in that they are XY, they could be underneath or overhead, to a world where tiles are more flexibly or arbitrarily three-dimensional from a top-down perspective, where you could have many different layers, many different levels, and the concept of elevation integrated into that system. And I think that going straight from where we are now to trying to do Foundry has levels, it was too big a step, and it was more of a step than I was comfortable trying to take on for '08. So my plan is for '08.2 to strictly implement fairly naive support for a binary state in terms of the tiles vertical positioning. It's either underneath or it's overhead, with limited flexibility to do more nuanced things, and then use that as the jumping off point to, from there, start thinking about what would it be like for tiles, for tokens, for walls, for lights, for all of those objects to have a concept of elevation and level, so that the contents of the scene could be rendered for any sort of vertical level, with the right assets, with the right walls, with the right lights. It's going to be complicated.
Mm-hmm.
I think I do see a path towards that in the future. But for the time being, the tile system is going to be just going to that next step, which is either they're underneath or they're overhead, with, of course, options to configure, the sorting of tiles within each of those stacks. So you'll have an underfoot stack that is z-index sorted. You'll have an overhead stack that is z-index sorted, but there's
Makes
only
sense.
two groups. And then the tokens are the meat in the middle of the sandwich. And so that's the objective for '08.2. And I think just getting that right, just getting that to work well, to look good, to have a good user experience, I think that's like it's a big enough step. And from there, I think the next go round would be to maybe think about, is it possible to have a big future update for Foundry that fully generalizes that system into having multiple groups, multiple levels, where some objects can span levels and be present on more than one, things like that. What would that need to look like from a data structure perspective? What would it need to look like from a canvas perspective?
Mm-hmm.
So that's all in my vision. I think, the vision is there, but the reality is that probably for now, there's not going to be much integration with elevation. Now, one thing I may do as part of 082, and this is still in the kind of brainstorming design process, is to allow you to specify the elevation, the height of the overhead tiles group, so that if you have like a building and a roof as an overhead tile, we could, in some cases, have a secondary token group where some tokens are on the roof while some tokens are under the roof. I'm not going to commit to that because I think just getting to the place where all tiles are overhead for all token, or
Mm-hmm.
overhead tiles are all overhead for all tokens, I think is going to be a lot of work, and so I don't know yet how smoothly that's going to go, and therefore how feature rich it will end up being.
Sounds good. Caligo, Elfren asks, what sort of plans do you have for the idea of extending the ability to embed documents arbitrarily deep? Being able to embed a spell on a wand and a bag on an actor on a ship would be amazing.
Mm-hmm. And then embed that ship in a canal, and then
well, let's not block up the flow of conversation here.
Yeah. Okay.
And this might be one, he asked, how much can you do this today? So if we want to swap to screen sharing for this, feel free. But
well, you can't do it at all today. To arbitrary depth. I'd be happy to screen share, but I wouldn't have much to show on this one. I think so. Part of the issue here is that it has to do with the way the documents are stored in NEDB or NEDB, as Cody prefers. Ultimately, when a change occurs to a document, the entire document is saved as a line item record in the database file. It's appended. And that entire document consists of, it's all of the attributes of the document, all of the embedded documents, all of the embedded documents, if such a thing existed. The entire tree becomes a single line item. And having that kind of depth of hierarchy while still supporting an API where you're able to make statements like, I want to update this specific part of the data, it becomes quite complicated. Mm-hmm. And so I think that it may be something that is done in the future. Like it's not an unsolvable problem, but it's also a thing that if it's done, it will add a lot of complexity. And I'm trying to temper that complexity and minimize that complexity as much as possible. And so I'm personally a fan of, instead of a deep hierarchy in terms of the child documents, I'm a fan of simply defining that data structure of those child documents, and using various things like a linked list or other data structures that can provide hierarchical or graphical structure to many nodes, basically. And so, I think you can have data that you use in a hierarchical way without the storage of that data being hierarchical. Like when we're writing all of the child documents to the database, we don't need to write them as objects within objects within objects within objects. We can write them as an array of objects, and then each of those objects, has the internal data to compute a graph or to compute a tree efficiently. I mean, it doesn't have to be slow. And so what I encourage developers who want to have this, like, I want a thing within a thing within a thing within an actor. I want an actor to have a backpack, and I want the backpack to have a scabbard, and I want the scabbard to have a sword, and I want the sword to have a gem. You don't necessarily need arbitrary depth in documents. You just need your documents to understand who their parent is, or you need you need your documents to understand who their children are. And so I guess that's more of the direction of my own thought process on it, in order to keep the database contracts more simple. They're already pretty complicated, even just with one layer of child documents. So
makes sense.
I would urge. I think so far my answers have been pretty much like, I like this idea and I'd love to see it happen someday. On this one, I would urge a little bit more caution. Like, I'm not sure about this idea. I'm not sure that it's a someday kind of thing. I think that possibly not, possibly yes. But for those of you who want like rich relationship between the items on an actor, for example, I think you should consider achieving that a different way.
I think, yes, no answers are great, but, talking about why and what problems does it have what problems does, a ship holding all these things pose from a technical aspect, and talking about that is interesting and, it helps explain. Caligo's thinking yes in chat right now, saying it's super insightful. Thanks. Caligo again asks on next question, with Foundry Core moving to a module infrastructure, and that's, modular JS, not package modules, how possible would it be to release a library module with just the utility functions of Foundry Core included? They gave examples of, I had asked for follow-up, let me quickly go find them. Things like the validators and other helpers in the Foundry API being available so developers could install it and then write unit tests against it, such they don't have to have Foundry running, but still run, the helper logic.
Yeah, I think this is probably a point at which I could screen share
Sure.
a little bit. Let me turn that on. Screens. There we go. Doop.
1 second, I'll get it set up on my side too. Pop it out. Watch stream. Nailed it. All right, we're good.
Okay, so let's see here. So currently, those helpers are in a module, the common module inside the Foundry code base, and in the packaged, in the distributed Foundry code. Let's see here. Oops, not that one. FoundryVTT. So under like resources app, this common folder is now, part of what is packaged with Foundry. So the common module is here in the code that you would install. So what does that common module have? At least at the moment, it has a couple of submodules. It has all of the constant definitions. It has the abstract classes for the document data model. It has data definitions. It has the document definitions. It has utility helper functions. And part of those data definitions are the validators that you're asking about. So here in the console, now I am inside Foundry, but importing of this module does not strictly require FoundryVTT to be running. So like if someone wanted to create some like external test or utility library or something, that would conceptually be achievable with this. So like the Foundry modules that I'm just talking about, they're under the Foundry namespace. So someone was asking about specifically like validators, foundry.data. These are all of the data objects, but in addition to that, there are all the field definitions. So the field definitions are all of the field types that appear in the data model. So for example, like an alpha field, an angle field, an audio field, JSON field. For those of you who haven't, looked too much at this yet, like I can show some examples of what I'm talking about. So for example, like an active effect data. So what is the data structure that is within an active effect? There is an ID, of course, it's an ID field. There's an array of changes, which define like what changes when the effect is active. There's a Boolean for whether the effect is enabled or disabled. Is a duration, which is its own child data structure that has its own schema. There's some other stuff, right? So all of these fields kind of define like what is the field type, like what is the details of this field in the data. So like the icon, for example, is an image field, and an image field, it is not required. It's a string. It's nullable. If a non-null value is provided, it has a validator for whether that is a valid image extension. There's an error string that is shown if it is not valid. So for example, like foundry.data.field.image field, this is in the module, like, and so this could be imported, and you could have, you could see this field definition, and that validation function has image extension that's also available. So foundry.data.validators has, let's see, the validators module has all of these different, well, there's not really that many, I guess, but there's some, like has image extension. These functions are available to use. So I think the original question is actually kind of achieved by this, unless there's aspects of it that aren't. This module can be loaded, can be imported, can be used outside of the context of Foundry specifically. Although please do bear in mind the licensing terms that you would need to use the kind of installed version of Foundry that you have. Like you're not allowed to repackage and ship this yourself, but you can use it.
Yeah, I think their question is, would you package just these portions yourself in something that would be installable, such that, say, a automatic workflow like GitHub Actions could run unit tests in the pipeline?
I see.
You're free to defer that.
Well,
that's an on-the-spot question, right?
Yeah, I think it depends on like who's doing it, right? Like if, for example, like if you own Foundry, you own the Foundry code, you have access to the Foundry code, you own a license, you have access to the code, you're allowed to put that code wherever you want, as long as your usage meets the other terms of the licensing agreement. So, you could write, for example, you're allowed to make backups, personal copies for your own backup usage, for example. You just can't distribute those backups. you could go into the Foundry code base, you could like zip up the common module, you could put that on your own private S3, and you could download it as part of a workflow. Now the question is like, are you distributing that code? Are you providing a place where people can just go download it? If you do it securely, I think you would be within the confines of the license. It's definitely not a use case that the license was written for. But I think there is like wiggle room where like if you set up your pipeline in a responsible way, you wouldn't be packaging and distributing the Foundry code. You would just be like pulling Foundry code into your automated testing environment. So yeah, I mean, if you do it carefully and you're not, and thoughtfully, I think that seems like it would be possible.
And that helps explain then, why not provide, one package. It's because you don't want anyone who has npm to just unilaterally be able to install this code, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm not trying to provide a SDK for other arbitrary software projects. Like I'm not trying to provide a document model to empower some project that's totally unrelated to Foundry VTT. I don't know. It's not something that I've thought a lot about, to be honest. I understand what is being requested, and I see why that might be useful to some people.
All right.
I'm not sure, I think one thing we could possibly engage on through like some follow-up feedback in the league channels is a little bit more like digging into this specific use case and figuring out like what's required, why is this needed, what's needed, is there a way we can make this possible for people to do? But yeah, I think it's probably not a super exciting answer, but I don't necessarily want to just like put out here's zips of the Foundry code, just go do whatever you want.
Yeah, understandable.
Yeah.
All right. Bad Idea Bureaus asks that currently the vast majority of the premium content available for Foundry is from existing publishers or creators. To what extent will this system be updated or rolled out to hobbyist module developers? And is there any plans to expand it in the future? Or are there other ways to tie monetization to access to Foundry?
Yeah, cool. Good question. So I have a couple answers there. One is just bearing in mind that the premium content protection system that exists it really was initially developed for the sort of specific use case of working with larger publishers in order to support a way for them to feel comfortable with making their copyrighted content available for Foundry. So that really was the still is to a degree the use case that's primarily being targeted and trying to be solved with that system. That being said, it does have some frictions associated with like onboarding to it and getting set up for it that aren't really ideal or designed with small indie creators in mind. So there's a couple of things that I'm working on that I can comment on as potential paths to improving that. The first thing, which is more of a non-answer. I'm going to have some real answers coming up, but the first one, which is sort of a non-answer, is that bear in mind that the Foundry license enables you as a software owner to create, to commercialize, and to sell content that is made for Foundry. So you don't need to be a premium content provider with a signed agreement with me to create something and sell it for Foundry. You're able to simply do that, and you can sell it wherever you want to. I think that's a really important aspect of my strategy, is that I want to be extremely liberal in terms of allowing creators to create with Foundry in mind, and to not have to go through some sort of specific process of approval or permission from me to do it. I don't want to gatekeep the content that people can make or choose to make, aside from whatever we need to do from a legal protection perspective. So that's a non-answer, but I think it is an important reminder, because I know some people may be under the impression of like, oh, well, I need to become a premium content provider in order to like make some content that I want to sell. You don't. Now, if you don't, you don't have the extra functionality or protections that the premium content system offers. So that is a drawback, but it's not required. And for some smaller creators, just self-servicing, I'm just going to make a thing and I'm just going to sell it on my, on my own little web store, or on drive-through, or on wherever I want to sell my stuff. That is a potentially viable approach.
Yeah.
So
go ahead.
Go ahead.
He additionally noted that he'd rather the fees that, there are other options, sure, but he'd rather those fees go to Foundry than any other platform.
Oh, well, that's kind of you to say, but I think there's room in the ecosystem for many participants. So moving on to the more specific answers, there's a couple of things that I'm working on. The first one is Patreon. So obviously, like with development decisions, I'm trying to hit the areas where there's the biggest gain for the investment. And I think Patreon is obviously a crucial cornerstone of content development and content creation. A lot of amazing creators on Patreon using sort of membership-based access to modules. So one of the things that I am working on a little bit at the moment, and going to get some help from Cody and the other new hires to continue investing into, is expanding on the Patreon account linking system that the Foundry website has. As many of you know, you can already link your Patreon account to the Foundry website, so that's already in place. But using that data in a more effective way to enable that system to keep track of membership for different specific creators, and allowing for creators to configure certain modules as being gated by Patreon membership. So one variety of the premium content system that I hope to deploy in the future is one that uses Patreon membership-based access, that can hopefully be a good solution for many of you who would rely on Patreon as your revenue generation vehicle. Now, that's one specific answer. Now, Patreon isn't the right fit for everyone. So I'm also working to see if it's easier, if there's a way to more seamlessly enable premium content for Foundry using a third-party marketplace like drive-through or other alternatives that might be able to handle a little bit more of the like common infrastructure at the point of sale, so that every individual content creator doesn't need to handle their own, API integration, their own, logic for dealing with keys, their own logic for vending downloads securely. So that's another path that I'm exploring, is to see like, is it possible to have a sort of understood arrangement with a common marketplace services provider that knows how to sell Foundry content, so that there might be something that can be done there. Last thing that I want to mention on this is that right now the premium content system is a bit of like a curated approach, sort of a working specifically with publishers, kind of white glove style engagement to shepherd their content onto Foundry. But obviously, as the system continues to grow and the ecosystem continues to grow, then I'll need to automate and to reduce the manual effort and manual cost involved with setting packages up and getting them launched and getting them announced and, doing all of that stuff. So, I think just passively over time, another thing that's going to happen is certain aspects of this process and this system are going to continue to get further automated and have more tools developed to make them self-service. And I think as that process continues, it will eventually reduce the sort of perceived or real barrier to entry for others who want to use that system, as machinery and automation can take the place of what is currently handled through like direct person-to-person engagement.
Yeah, I really do aim to replace my job with a robot as soon as possible. Our next question is from Examinator. Will there be improvements to the file manager in the foreseeable future? Things like deleting files, previews for audio and video files, system-wide file search, etc. And tangent to that, I personally know that settings will have file picker, which is exciting. I just want to note that that's coming out.
Yeah, I think that's a little bit like tangential to the question, which is sort of a little bit more about like, will I expose more powerful tools around, file searching, traversal, discovery, management. So foreseeable future is a little bit of a ambiguous horizon. I do foresee improvements to file management, although I think that's taking a little bit of a weaselly answer to the question. I don't have planned improvements in this area at the moment, beyond what has already launched in 081 and 082. However, I do think that some of the specific examples that are mentioned are ones that I do envision adding in the future. I think file deletion, to be honest, I've just kind of been postponing it just because like I want to feel confident that Foundry is like well established. It's, that authentication is handled well, that,
Yeah, it makes sense.
Things like that. For better or worse, and I think many of you would argue for worse, but there are reasons why this was done. As many of you know, the access keys that get someone into a world are not encrypted. And there's reasons for that. There are, I think, arguably good reasons for that. But, a consequence of that, for example, is that do you really feel secure with someone that has game master permission, being able to delete files from the computer that is hosting your server? Mm-hmm. Is that a permission that you feel good about? Do we feel confident that the way that all of this has been developed is, that the security is in place, that it really is impossible for someone to delete a file that's outside of Foundry's permitted sandbox? Now, I think I'm confident in that. I don't make that statement to make you all nervous. I feel pretty good about the validations that exist, but from time to time, someone will reach out to me privately and say, like, I found a way to trick Foundry into letting me do something I shouldn't be able to do. And, that happens. And so giving it the permission to delete files off of your hard drive it's just a little bit nervous. And so I feel confident leaving that to the operating system of the person who's running the server. That was kind of the safe choice. And so that's the choice I made. But in the future, I think file deletion probably will exist with some protections. Well, hopefully more than just some. I think recursive search. Yeah, I think that's pretty reasonable. Honestly, it's not the actual algorithm part of recursive search that's hard. That's easy. It's the UI part of recursive search. So a lot of features aren't limited by the ability to write the code to do it. They're limited by just how tricky it is to come up with a good UI UX. Like once you add recursive search, you need an interface that feels and works really well for searching recursively. And that makes the interface of the file browser much more complicated. I forget some of the other specific examples, but yeah, I probably won't comment more on this just because there's nothing that's specifically planned. But these are all good suggestions. So I think they would all be things that I might envision for future improvements without necessarily being something that's been slated yet.
The next few questions all start getting into the nitty gritty of examples or details or API changes,
Cool.
which is why we didn't swap back to video cams just for those two questions. Nork asks, can you provide an example of a new or changed piece of the API that would potentially eliminate some awkward workaround code for module and system devs that exist in 07?
Yeah,
I'm guessing this is going to be a document example, but obviously you have your pick.
Well, there's probably lots of things that I think you can do in a simplified way. So Cody, you mentioned file picker as a new setting option. I think that's just since you mentioned it, I don't necessarily think that's the best example, but I think that's a example. I can show what that looks like real quick. So register settings. So let's see if I can get this right first try. Probably not. So we want a setting called like some file. We want to get a file path. I'm not going to worry about localization for the time being. Could be, any scope. We'll put it in the config. So this is the recipe. File paths or folder paths, they're strings.
Makes sense.
But there is an extra option in the setting registration. You can just set a true that you want to use a file picker for the the widget that provides setting functionality. So actually, I'm going to need to rebuild my code if I'm demoing stuff. So having registered that setting, there's now a some file, choose a file in my settings menu that will let me choose a file. So I can, choose a Schwinga token, and that will be stored in my, in my settings. And so it just an extra thing that maybe shortcuts some of the requirement for an extra dependency or requirement for you to code up a custom interface for your settings when what you need is a file or a folder as the thing that you're storing.
Yeah, I'm sure tons of people are excited about that one. I know that that's been one of the more requested, setting features for a while.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that's one. I'm going to remove that now. So another thing that comes to mind is, let's see, constructing a dice roll or a dice pool from a constituent set of pieces. So I'm thinking like before in 07, sometimes, the prior assumption was sort of that you would start with a string formula and everything would originate from there, and then you would create all of the objects by providing this sort of magic string syntax. It's really not realistic. Sometimes you actually have objects and you want to like package them together. So suppose I have here, I'm just over in the console, suppose I've got like roll 1, new roll 2d6. Suppose I have roll 2, new roll 3d8. I've got roll 3, new roll 1d10. So suppose I wanted to create a dice pool out of these constituent rolls. You used to have to do some real black magic to do things like that. So now you can do like new dice pool, and there's a, well, actually not new, there's a factory method, dice pool from rolls. I can pass this array of roll 1, roll 2, roll 3. And then I've got my dice pool with the rolls it contains. It will function just as a dice pool. Different ways to create these objects in the dice API that don't necessarily require you to start with the string. Like you can start with the object and then create the roll from there. Another example would be sort of like, so one way I can create a roll is like new roll 1d20 plus 3 plus 2, right? But I could create that same type of roll from a constituent array of the terms that it includes, where it's got a die, an operator, a number, an operator, a number. I can do the same thing by starting with the terms and building from like the ground up to actually get to my roll. So that's thing. I guess that's one thing. Certainly async rolls. That's something that I think is a viable answer to this question. On the document side, I think a lot of aspects of working with unlinked tokens, the document experience of working with those unlinked tokens is now much more straightforward, in that it should use all of the same event workflows and methods and pipelines that a regular actor would go through. It's just that the actor is a token instead of a full actor. I can give some examples on that if it's desired, but I'm trying to think just about the original question, piece of the API that could potentially eliminate awkward workaround code. I think part of the thing that I struggle with this is I don't necessarily have direct visibility into what types of awkward workaround code people are doing. I know some examples, obviously, like I try and pay attention to that, but I think part of what would be good opportunity for further engagement and feedback mechanism with the league is like, what are some of the common patterns of awkward workaround code that frequently come up? What are some of the things that people are frequently forced to do in order to compensate for a deficiency in the core software? I think collecting that information, I think, could be really useful, because eliminating those things by adding better APIs for people to use, better methods for people to call, that's definitely an objective of mine. Anything occur to
write that down?
Anything occur to you, Cody, or maybe anyone in chat about something specific there?
Caligo's asking if there were any things you were doing in D&D 5e that you were able to improve upon with the new document or other changes in 808.
Yeah, totally. So, for example, let's see. One of the things that's really useful in 08 is that document. Let me actually, before I talk about this specifically, let me pull up the actual document base class. So in the document base class, this is the common model, just the base document model. One of the things that every document can do is it has asynchronous pre-hook. It had not hooks. Hooks is the wrong word. It has asynchronous pre-event methods that get called before that document is created, updated, or deleted. So this is pretty powerful. Like whenever something else needs to happen in addition to, something that's happening. So for example, in like 5e, we'd have a workflow where, if we've got the hero monster, the hero character, the druid, advances from druid level 1 to druid level 3, we automatically add class features for those new levels, like druid circle, wild shape, etc. So like how does that happen? Deleted the wrong things, but that's fine. In the 5e system, this is an example of using this like pre-create or pre-update, so that whenever a class type item is created or updated, we can also know to identify and possibly create other items as other class features. This was like kind of hard to do, and required some pretty janky like workaround code previously.
Awesome. I'm sure I'm sure 5e users appreciate that kind of smoother workflow, or at the very least, you appreciate supporting it in a cleaner way.
Yeah, well, hopefully both. I mean, there's lots of examples like that all around. I think overall, I feel like '08, while it does have some adaptation cost, I think the overall quality of the software framework and API is vastly improved. So I hope that the developers here will eventually come around to the perspective that whatever effort was required in order to onboard to '08 was definitely worth it in exchange for the increased power, cleanliness, functionality, readability of the code that you're writing.
Yeah, and on that note, sometime soon the league is hoping to host a hackathon's maybe the wrong word, but a weekend where we all get together and start, working on getting up to 08x and helping each other with our questions along the way, streaming people working on it and such. So look forward to when we get that planned. We certainly won't announce it today on April 1st. We've made that mistake once already. Speaking of awkward workarounds, and a question that's further down the list I was alerted to from Vance. Currently, application render wraps application render where render is async, but the promise is not returned up the chain. That means after calling render, you cannot access a create at DOM, nor can you await the result to do so. Is there a way to resolve that?
Yes. Well, this is the kind of thing that like the application class was one of the earliest interfaces that I wrote, and it did this out of a misguided notion that I might need to wrap the asynchronous renderer in a method that doesn't await its work in order to trigger certain renders and just keep going on with other important stuff while that render simply occurs in the background. Now, in retrospect, this was definitely a misguided design choice. It's not necessary. You can just make the function asynchronous and choose not to await it. So it's a bit silly. I think at this point, the rationale for changing it is not strong. It's just that I'm trying to manage the number of breaking changes that will affect lots of people in a cautious way, and changing the render method to get rid of this unnecessary wrapping and simply become, async. Like in theory, all we need is just this, and then this thing goes away. Like this is probably what it should be. It should just render asynchronously, and that's that, and you don't need any of this other stuff. But it this is the current design, and changing the return type of the render method, it's not something that I wanted to take on at the moment. I think for bigger breaking changes like this, I want to be frugal and only do a couple at a time. So yeah, it does also serve a purpose of like wrapping the inner function in case someone's module defined render process breaks. It like there's some error handling, but basically this is not a great design, and I acknowledge that. And I think, as I mentioned previously, I think as the underlying document interface became really due for a renovation, and that was the main focus of '08, I think the application interface is probably next up on the list. And I don't want to commit to it, but my hunch is that a sort of application V2, so to speak, option will be probably a central focus of 0.9.
Sounds good. And yeah, I think this is a great time to, as you mentioned, I think the developer community raising up, hey, this is a little annoying. Some of these things are just like, oh man, I hadn't even thought of that, or this is old design. Let's if make sure these things are in GitLab issues, make sure you raise them up so that we can help prioritize them and things like that. Share workarounds with your fellow peers and such too as you have them. If we can, a popular thing to do is to make a shared library and then host it, and then look, now everything's using that one thing, and Foundry can go look at that one shared library and for inspiration of where to solve those issues. So yeah. You talked about the parenthetical terms and other things of roles, and I see two questions here about those, so we'll skip to those briefly. Both are from Cole. The first one is there anything preventing parenthetical terms from having a flavor component?
Yeah, it would require that parenthetical term to have some sort of attribution logic for where to put that flavor once the parenthetical is evaluated. Not an unapproachable problem, but it is important to acknowledge that ultimately there is no parenthetical term in the evaluated role. So for example, suppose I create a role, new role, parentheses 2d6 plus 3 end parentheses times 48, right? So my role before evaluation, it starts as a parenthetical term, it starts as an operator term, and then there's a dice term, a die term. Now, when the role is evaluated, the parenthetical term is going to be evaluated first, and the result of the parenthetical term is going to be substituted back in to the term list in order to facilitate full evaluation of the role, and that happens recursively. So when this role is evaluated, the terms end up being a numeric term, an operator term, and a die. So the parenthetical term ultimately gets evaluated down to just a number. And while we can recover the original formula, the evaluated formula ended up being, 9 times 48. And in this case, it would be pretty straightforward, I suppose, that if you had initially defined flavor text on the parenthetical, like, fire damage, we could keep that around until such a time as that parenthetical is evaluated and it becomes a numeric term. And then we could carry that flavor down onto the numeric term. And I think, that's a good idea and that's good feedback. It's just not a feature that exists right now. It's not impossible, but I guess the short answer is the parenthetical term doesn't have flavor right now because ultimately the parenthetical term is gone. So it could support flavor text by just like keeping that flavor text and any other options around until such a point as those options are transferred down to the numeric term that represents its evaluated state.
Makes sense. He also asks, you showed how you can do, those factory methods for roles and such. Is there potentially, eventually, going to be an option for parenthetical term from term, similar to role from terms?
Yeah, I think so. So let's see.
The questions get harder the further down this list we go.
I think this one's actually fairly straightforward. Just trying to make sure I understand the question properly. Oh, hello. Hope I don't have to go get that. I don't know if you heard that. Someone's at my door. I'm just going to listen for a second, and if nothing happens, I might have to go get it.
Okay.
Ooh, what am I doing right now? Sorry, that really sort of threw me for a loop. So the parenthetical term, it starts out as just a string list in that way. When the parenthetical term is evaluated, that parenthetical term generates an inner role, which itself has the inner formula of the parenthetical and the inner terms of the parenthetical. But that happens, it happens when the parenthetical is evaluated. Now, it could happen earlier, in which case you could have a way to create the parenthetical from a set of terms in the way that you can create a role from a set of terms. It's not perhaps so straightforward right now to do that, although I think it could be. That also would be a reasonable suggestion to try and get into our backlog. So with the new dice system, it obviously opens up certain doors to like continue making improvements. So when the parenthetical is evaluated, a role is constructed for the string that's inside the parentheses, and that internal role is evaluated. Now, if you already had the internal role, you could kind of bootstrap up a parenthetical from that. And that's something that other term types support. So I do think it would be reasonable for the parenthetical term to also support it. So I think that's an action item takeaway for me to perhaps do. I don't know if like Matt or Nath is listening in, but maybe you can take a note so that I don't forget about that suggestion.
All right, now that the word parenthetical has lost most of its meaning to me, back to the order of the list. Bad Ideas Bureau asks, given the shorter beta phase for 08, is a 0710 release still planned?
Tentatively, yes. Because I think what I want to do before 08 becomes release is to, if almost nothing else, there's one, there's two things that at very least that I'd like to put into a final version in 07. One is some additional logic that will help with the migration process to allow for an upward migration of 0710 to 08. Let's call it 085 or 084, whatever the release version ends up being. So in order to do that and to understand whether that's possible, the application needs to, consult the Node.js version that it's running in order to see if it's running a suitably advanced Node 14 plus. And if it's running Node 14 plus, and in the case of the Electron app, if it's Electron version, minimum X, then it is in an environment where it is possible to upgrade directly to 08 from inside the software. And so I'd like to make sure that upgrade path is available for people who are already running Node 14, people who are already running like a more modern Electron wrapper. Although I think for Electron, I think everyone's going to have to reinstall, because Electron, it really requires the new version. So I don't know. We'll see on that. But I think so. That's one thing. And then there is like one or two, not like ultra critical. Well, not even critical, but there's a couple of like little sort of moderate security fixes that just in case someone does stay on '07 forever, I can backport a couple of those. But yeah, as far as like when that might happen, it would probably be like shortly before a '08 release update. I don't envision doing a lot of work to add features or bug fixes to '07. I mean, ultimately, I want people to upgrade to '08.
Makes sense. All right, last of the pre-submitted questions. I know we've gotten some questions while the stream has been going on. Now's a great time to put out, while we still have about half an hour left. If you have questions that have come out during the stream, new questions you've, brainstormed or follow-up questions, feel free to submit them, preferably in the Discord, but otherwise in the Twitch. Our moderators will grab them, throw them in a channel for me. All right, so Luke Abbey asks, do you have any plans for expanding how dependencies work? An example would be optional dependencies, things like something like libwrapper where shim is available for when users have not installed it, but when they have installed it, uses that instead. Yeah, that's what it boils down to.
Yeah, I'd probably be inflating unfairly the degree to which this is going to happen if I said I have plans for that. I don't have plans for that. However, continuing to improve the way that modules can be packaged for Foundry and can, work in concert is obviously a sort of always on priority. I think there's a few things in terms of packaging that is on the docket for '08 too, that, those will be places to start because those have been prioritized. But beyond that, for, '09, the '09 release cycle, there's always the opportunity to do more in terms of packaging and support for modules and things like that. So as far as dependencies go, I definitely acknowledge that there isn't a good way in the Foundry manifests right now to differentiate between an absolutely required dependency versus a sort of opt-in or soft dependency where, like, if you have this other module, you will be able to access some additional features. So like this map right here was from the free map pack that we put out today from Reclusive Cartographer. It's really great. Encourage everyone to check that out. And Reclusive Cartographer in his maps has some built-in drawings that are, designed to support multi-level tokens if multi-level tokens is present. And there's not really currently a good way to configure that as like you get some extra functionality with MLT, but MLT isn't absolutely strictly required in that, like, we're not going to force you to install MLT in order to use this map pack. So an ability to differentiate between required dependencies and kind of optional ones, I agree that would be a good improvement, as well as other ways to allow modules to interact with each other and to provide supplementary or helper functionality. Now, I think that this is an area where I'm hoping that Cody, obviously, like you've contributed a lot towards the manifest plus scoping and idea space. And so I think this is an area where, as you come on board, this is an area where I think you would be well positioned to try and help prioritize, like, what are the core Foundry improvements that will best help the module development community, because you've got such a direct perspective on this topic.
Sweet. Jucasis, I'm sure I pronounced it incorrectly, I'm sorry, asked that while on the 081 live stream you showed off the seek functionality for playlist interfaces. It's not implemented in the UI yet, or will be. I can't quite follow, but can you show how you'd interact with seeking audio from the API perspective?
Ooh, tough one. In theory, I should be able to do that.
I mean, I heard you know the
In theory.
person who wrote the engine.
In theory. So let me put some music playing. I don't know if that comes through on screen share. It's probably not super important that it does or does not. Probably it doesn't, but don't worry about it. What is important is that you would see that this Soul Knife track is playing right now, and I'll just pause it at 21 seconds. So if I get that particular sound, so I've got the sound document. I can go to the actual sound node, which is the web audio interface. So seeking is as simple as calling the play function with a particular offset. So let me pull that up in the API. It's under client audio sound. So one of the arguments of the play function is an offset, which is the specific offset in seconds at which to begin playback. So what would that mean? If I were to just take the sound node and its duration is 187 seconds, suppose I wanted to start playing it 10 seconds from the end, I can do S sound play, and then just checking it's all an object of arguments. So offset would be s.sound.duration minus 10. So let's see if this works. I don't know that worked.
We might have to re-render the UI.
Interesting. Maybe it has a really quiet fade out for the last 10 seconds or something. Let me try a different offset. Let's try 30 seconds in. Okay, so something is not doing what I expected that it would do. I need to think why that might be. So interesting. If it's already playing, then this is working the way that I expected it to, but I just jumped to 20 seconds from the end. I can seek back to 30 seconds in. For some reason though, and that is working, but for some reason when it was paused, it was not doing what I had expected it to do. What if I fully stop it and then yeah, this is weird.
Well, it's possible that this is why testing happens and why developers can start using that.
Now, the intention of this offset parameter is that this is how you would seek. And it is working when the sound is already playing, but it does not seem to be working from a full stop, where if the sound is not playing, it does not seem to be working right now. So yeah, obviously bear in mind that that alpha code needs alpha testers, but in theory, this is what you would do, and it does work. For what it's worth, when the sound is already playing, it does seek to the position requested. It's not doing what I expected from a hard stop.
Math is
Yeah,
suggesting checking that the other songs play without the API.
yeah, it is. I mean, I've got audio. It's definitely just something tricky about like this syntax that's not starting and seeking at the same time, which it should be doing. So I'll have to maybe look into that. That's another one for Nath or Matt to take a note of for me.
That said, I think that was still a helpful example of how, like, an API, a
But
more
yeah,
module dev would use it.
the API should be very simple. You just call the play method with a specific offset that you want to seek to.
Nork asks, he knows that editing an item's active effects directly while it's embedded on an actor is not within scope for 08x. Can you clarify some of the challenges involved in this and what the path forward is for the future versions?
Yeah, so this goes to the prior question about like infinite depth of documents. So an active effect on an owned item on an actor would be a layer of document depth that the document model simply does not support at this time. So it's in a hard place to solve. It means either the document model itself needs to be overhauled further to support arbitrary document depth, or it means that it needs a sort of approximation where we fake it by providing a sort of overlaid interface to active effects on an owned item that really it's just updating the owned item. It's not actually updating the individual active effect documents. So yeah, I think, unfortunately that is in a difficult place. The intention of the system had kind of been a little bit that like the active effects the item has is a little bit more immutable. So it's like you might have the item or not have the item, but when you have the item, you have the item's effects, sort of end of story. And I think that's a little bit naive because there's obviously lots of complicated things that can happen in game systems where you might have the item but the item might have multiple states. And so different effects or changing effects on the item that you have it has value. There's a couple of potential paths forward. One is, like I said, expanding further the document model to actually support arbitrary child document depth. Another is faking it with an interface to modify effects specifically on items that's not really doing that. It just sort of makes it seem like it's doing it. The other idea is to transfer all of the effects to the actor instead of just some of them, but retain a sort of sibling-like relationship of that some effects actually belong to certain items that the actor owns. So that's a third approach that would have its own pros and cons. So I think it's just a thing that's in a little bit of a state of ambiguity around the best way to solve it, because the different solution paths all have fairly considerable costs and drawbacks.
Follow-up question from Zeal on that. Could we eventually see API support that abstracts a flat tree storage that you mentioned in terms of, like, rather than storing in the database a bag holding items, maybe all documents just have a children field, as I believe the question. They're looking to fake that kind of flat storage structure across all documents ever, I believe. Developers are less concerned with how the data is stored, more concerned with how they can access on the front end. Adding an item to an item is already possible, but requires a lot of custom handling. Having this baked in the API would make it simpler for systems and modules for this type of structure.
Yeah, I mean, pardon me if I misheard, but that was a statement, I think, rather than a question, and it's a statement I agree with.
I think the question
It would
was,
make it simpler.
could we see it? But yeah, it sounds like eventually yes.
Yeah, I mean, I do agree with the statement though that if the software supported it, it would be easier. That's definitely a true statement. I think the whole work is in the first part of that, which is if the software supported it. I think that's where all the work is, and I think that arbitrary document depth is only one way to solve this type of problem. It's not the only way, but it is a complicated and costly way to solve it, and it's one that could unleash a torrent of not currently existing bugs into the software. So I think it's the kind of change that would need to be made with a lot of confidence and caution that it can be done properly. I'm not saying that isn't the case, but it's not the.
All right. Zeal's quickly typing, so I'm making sure that he doesn't have a follow up to that. He says the point would be to avoid arbitrary document depth by faking it as part of as a standard part of the API.
Okay, I think what is meant by that is adding some extra attributes to the item data model, which handle the sort of linked list or hierarchical references that are needed in order to create that sort of hierarchical structure, just the way that every document can have a folder and every folder can have a parent folder. And because those are in the data model, then we're able to build the tree. Mm-hmm. I think that's what's being proposed, that an item might have a parent item, and if that's put in the data model directly, then the core software could provide some tools to make that easy to work with. That makes sense. I think that's the right investment to make once I really decide that supporting arbitrary document depths is not the right solution. Because adding support to the API to simulate hierarchical structures with a sort of flat set of siblings, that's the right tooling to build if a flat set of sibling documents is the desired solution, mm-hmm. But it's not the right set of tooling to build if, on the other hand, I'm going to go actually do the work to support arbitrary document parent-child relationships. So I think a decision needs to be made beforehand, and that decision at the moment is, I think, more of the blocker than anything else.
Okay. White Spine asks, are there any plans for allowing server-side hooks and modules? And I'll add on.
No.
Yeah, I figured that. We've talked about it in the past, and for security reasons, you'll never be able to edit this actual running server or things like the login page and such. It's too hard to make secure. But the question I'll add on to that is, a lot of people currently run into issues where they want to run something once ever. And a popular workaround to this is to grab either a GM, which then accidentally runs more than once if there's more than one, or to grab the first GM it sees. But because it runs on all clients at once, you end up with concurrency issues. What are your thoughts on people looking to run a piece of code once ever as a hook?
Yeah, that's a good question. So there's a couple of techniques, and it really depends on what situation you find yourself in. The best thing to do, if you can, is to have the client that initiates a certain request also perform the follow-up request. Now, this is only possible if the capabilities of that user are compatible with what the follow-up thing that needs to be done is. But, if the user who did thing A can also do thing B, having that same user do thing B directly is the best approach. Now, let's assume that that's not the case, and instead we're in a situation where in response to something a player does, the GM needs to do something. That is a little trickier. I think now, in a world with one GM, it's pretty easy because you see the event happen, and if you're the GM, you take the follow-up action. In a world with multiple game masters, you do end up with this potential concurrency issue where both GMs might respond to the same upstream event. Again, you're faced with a choice. Does that matter? Yes or no? Maybe it doesn't really matter. It could be that if your response is cheap and if your response is idempotent, then you don't need to care. You can do it twice. You can do it 3 times, and it doesn't really matter. Now, let's assume that that's not the case. And so really, like, you're wanting to respond to a thing where you really only want to respond once, and you only want one GM to respond because it's expensive if you do it more than once, or you'll get the wrong result if you do it more than once. Then this is a case where there's some tricks you can do. One thing that you can do, for example, is you can do game users find. So we want like an active user who is a GM, and we want this, something like this can give us the first active GM user. And then, you might say something like, do thing is, are you the first active GM user? In this case, I am. But, this is a paradigm that you could use to designate one game master that should be the one to take the action. The game user's map is sorted in a predictable way, so everyone's client would agree on this answer in theory.
Yeah, I've seen this pattern used before. I think they also additionally ordered by ID just to be sure, but
it's not gloriously elegant, but it is just one line of code to decide if you should be the one to react or not. That's what the current state is in terms of what's possible. In terms of the future state, this is a fairly common paradigm that occurs. So there is a different way that you could resolve this. For example, so suppose I do like hooks on update actor console log. I'll just like log what happens on an update actor hook. Now suppose I'll have an actor. I just need the name here. One thing you could do, for example, is suppose I want to update the actor to name, someone else. When I pass in the update context, I could say something like, reaction or like responsible GM is going to be Tim. This in theory might be a user ID or something. So like when I make this update, on the far side of the hook, I've transacted that piece of data all the way through the hook. And so the people receiving the hook on the far side see that set of instructions that were provided to the update context, and can then have everyone agree that this is going to be the, the responsible party who's designated as needing to take some follow-up action. So you can augment the data that goes through the hook so that the receivers of it can know how to react without needing to guess. That is another approach that could be taken.
Yeah, those were some good approaches. For my own personal use case, I have a module I'm working on. It syncs journals from an external API source. I obviously don't want to run that, more than once on a given, really across all the users. Right now, what I do is, I go in, I make sure they're a GM on load. I, lock at the start of the update such that someone else doesn't accidentally trigger if they're also a GM, and then unlock at the end, and now they have a last update tag so no one tries again. But there are certain West Marches campaigns where there's like a dozen GMs and there's hundreds of players, and my concern is always that some two GMs are going to log in and accidentally bypass the lock and it'll sync twice. Not a very realistic concern, but yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think whether this is something that I ever provide a framework for in core or not, it's possible. I think as a reusable design, what you might do is you might rely on a socket emit and have a two-step process. One where you send a socket to poll like who is an available GM who can do this action. And then everyone who receives that, if they meet the condition of, oh, I can do this action, they respond back. And then the initial requester identifies the first respondent, and then sends another relay that would get that person to actually do the thing. It could be built into some sort of reusable framework, but all of these things exist to solve specific problems, and sometimes if you assume what the problem someone's trying to solve is, you might not build a tool that actually works for them. So I think this is one thing that's kind of still a little bit in a wait and see mode for me. I'd like to see some people try using this model and see like if it's working for them. I don't think in many modules I've seen people doing this, of like sending additional context data along with their update. And I feel like, to me, that's maybe in some ways a potentially nicer solution, although it's not completely foolproof.
Yeah, makes sense. All right, we have 6 minutes remaining. We'll leave that time for anything else you want to talk about. Do you want to give an example of something you think people should know about? Do you want to talk about future plans? Do you just want to, I don't know, hang out?
Well, I guess I can't believe we've almost used exactly the right amount of time. I don't know how that ended up happening. I thought that probably we were going to run out of time and have lots of unanswered questions. So I'm glad that
my missed one question.
I'm glad my long-winded answers were not too long-winded in hindsight. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I guess I don't have too much intentionally missed. What question did I miss?
Well, no. The only one I didn't ask is someone from Twitch was asking on the topic of role formulas. After 09x, when roles will be entirely async, will there be a way to call it synchronously?
Yeah. So this is part of the migration path, is that when you when you evaluate a role in 09, you will be able to opt in and still request that it is async false. So that will still be possible in 09. That will no longer be possible in the one after that. But for now and for 09, you will be able to continue rolling synchronously by passing async false to your evaluation call.
In O10, then when that goes away, you want to use the .then syntax, which is part of JavaScript, in order to await a promise and then continue synchronously. I don't know if you want to just quickly show what that looks like in the console. Does console support .then? I assume so.
Yeah.
You want async true, right?
Thank you. So yeah, you would have to wrap your additional code inside a callback. Yeah.
All right. Go ahead.
If your outer function is not async, then yeah, you would need to use something like this because you won't be able to await it.
All right. Yeah, and look at that. Pretty much exactly the right amount of time. Atro, it's been great. I look forward to working more closely with you in the future. I don't know. I doubt we'll do this like every, update, but I think hopefully we can do this kind of thing at least once per release train, where we just talk about, as we start looking at going to beta, just talk about developer questions and migration paths and things like that, and what's coming up in the future things.
I want to just use one last second to respond to Deck Starglow in Twitch chat that says a specific problem is that prepare derived data presumably in the actor has no way of waiting for the promise to resolve. This is a design problem, I think. So there is a little bit of thought that needs to go into like, where are you using roles and why? If you are using roles inside your prepare derived data for your actor, then presumably you've gotten yourself into a point where your actor data is non-deterministic, in that like each time you prepare your actor data, it might be something different, something unpredictable, because you've introduced a random element into that data preparation. Now, I'm going to assume that isn't actually what you want, because I don't think it makes any sense that your actor data preparation would be non-deterministic. I think what you want is that you maybe have some kind of dynamic relationship in your data where you, like, someone's attack bonus is equal to their modifier plus some other thing, and you're using the dice syntax as a way to glue that together. We do that in the 5e system with the maximum number of item uses per like short rest or something like that. Can be a formula now where that formula would be equal to some formula expression. There is a helper method in the role class that allows you to do the like data substitution and parsing without actually rolling dice. So as long as you don't need to roll dice, you can do everything that you need to synchronously. So for example, suppose I just want to evaluate the expression like strength plus 3, and I've got some object of data that says my strength is 2, right? This part is all synchronous, and we can safely evaluate the parsed formula and get 5, and we haven't had to roll any dice, right? Because it's not non-deterministic. We're just parsing some of the role syntax down. So as long as that's the situation you're in, you'll be fine. There's going to be ways to do this synchronously without needing to do any rolling at all.
That actually taught me something as well, so I'm glad that you took the time to answer
that. Cool. Well,
that was exactly what he was looking for. Awesome.
Nice. All right, folks. Well, thanks for hanging out. Thanks for the questions. I hope this was useful. And Cody, thanks for hosting.
Absolutely.
Appreciate that.
All of this will be thrown. We for like a day had a league YouTube until YouTube banned it for being. I don't really know why. I guess like because we tried uploading a 2 hour
Having two,
video.
presumably having too ridiculous a channel name.
Yeah, I'm guessing they saw it was a brand new account to a brand new Gmail, and then we uploaded a 2 hour video, and they're like, no. We'll figure out where we're going to host it, but it will be hosted somewhere so people can watch in the future. We encourage everyone to hang out in the league's Foundry 081 research channel. They'll keep updating as releases come out. It's where you and your fellow developers can research things, talk about migration paths, figure out what's up. We have a whole wiki that we have linked to that with problems and breaking changes that have happened and how to work through them. It's all been a community effort. I love this community very much. I'm excited that we'll be able to continue to grow and nurse the community, officially. And this has been great. Have a great day, everyone. And thanks again.
Cheers, folks.